Walter, thank you for your always generous uh, welcomes, which we all know are legendary already in the history of the center. Um, and thanks everyone for coming to the talk, colleagues, friends, and students. Always good to see students. Uh, so, as Walter actually mentioned, this is I've already given two presentations over the last few years on uh, chapters that are part of the current book that I've been working on for the last few years. COVID dramatically slowed down the process, but this is already my third talk on that project, which means it is steadily but slowly moving forward. So um, one thing I wanted to mention before I start reading, I'll just gonna share some notes, but I'll still read just to keep it organized. I will be quoting from some of the poems that I will be discussing. And what I've done is I will actually be quoting in Spanish because I think it's important and nice to get a sense of the sound of the poetry. And Julia de Burgos is a very kind of musical poet. However, I uploaded in the comments, in the slides, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint. The translation in English is going to be line by line next to the passages I'll be quoting. So you can always follow along in English what I am reading in Spanish. It will be clearly identified in red. And if you want full versions of the poems, I uploaded them in the comments in the chat section. There's a PDF there with some of the poems that I'll be talking about in Spanish and English side by side, so that you can get a sense. So having said that, I will get started, and I will start sharing my screen. Participants can see my application now, and I will be into full screen. And we will get started. Well, so today I will be talking about Julia de Burgos. Julia de Burgos can be regarded as Puerto Rico's best known poet, both within the island and internationally. By far, she's a very well known all over Latin America and within the Latino community in the US. She was an important member of what critics have called La Generación del 1930, an important generation of writers in Puerto Rico. And broadly speaking, one may find two main themes running through her poetry. Some of her poems are explicitly political and offer strong denunciations of social injustices and calls for Puerto Rico's emancipation from US colonial domination. Other compositions are highly lyrical love poems, frequently addressed to an abstract, elusive lover, where the language of passion often takes the form of mystical longing for union with nature. Through all these works, one can hear a rebellious feminist voice that assertively claims her space as a subject with rights and desires within a male-dominated society. She only published 2 books in her lifetime, Poema en 20 surcos, Poem in 20 furrows from 1938, and Canción de la Verdad Sencilla, Song of the Simple Truth from 1939, with a posthumous collection, El Mar y Tú, The Sea and You, appearing in 1953. Although the quality of her work was recognized since the publication of her first book, part of her fame certainly rests on the public's fascination with her personal life, full of amorous dramas and betrayals, which took her first from Puerto Rico to Cuba, and then to her last years in New York City, where her alcoholism led to her untimely, tragic death. Several of her poems have been set to music, and there have been numerous visual artists that have honored her through her art, culminating with her inclusion in a US Postal Service stamp, a dubious honor if one considers her lifelong militancy in Puerto Rico's nationalist movement. In this presentation, I would like to focus on the role that nature plays in Burgos's poetry, a role that many critics have long highlighted as fundamental. More specifically, critics have underscored the deep connection between the way in which the poetic subject in her poems articulates her sense of selfhood and her attitude toward the natural world. A recurrent theme in Burgos's poems is the tension between the quote-unquote natural and the quote-unquote artificial, which is expressed firstly as a struggle within the poetic subject. In one of her best-known poems, A Julia de Burgos, the poet addresses herself in this way: Tú eres fría muñeca de mentira social, y yo, viril destello de humana verdad. Tú eres solo la grave señora señorona, yo no, yo soy la vida, la fuerza, la mujer. Tú te rizas el pelo y te pintas, yo no. A mí me riza el viento, a mí me pinta el sol. You're the cold doll of social lies, and I am the virile flash of human truth. You are only the ponderous lady, very lady, not me. I am life, strength, woman. You curl your hair and paint yourself, not me. The wind curls me, the sun paints me. And again, she's talking to herself. Thus, in line with the long romantic tradition, true selfhood is portrayed as a realm of authenticity that is coextensive with the realm of natural forces, and which precedes and escapes the artificiality of social conventions. At other times, we can see the tension between the natural and the artificial in the attempt to ground and model the human realm of social relations on the seemingly harmonious relation of the elements in nature and on the concreteness of the earth itself. In her poem Amaneceres, Dawnings, we read, Cuando se abre la puerta íntima para entrar a una misma, ¿qué de amaneceres? Allí dentro, bien adentro, asomarse a la vida, ver, oír, oler, gustar y tocar tierra, el hombre tierra hecho a dos dimensiones violentas, la dimensión común, 5 sentidos y un cuerpo y una mente, la otra, la dimensión social, la tradición, la raza, el capital, el hombre aburguesado, a ese hombre burgués hay que destruirlo, ahora. Here, the artificial dimension of oppressive social constructs crystallizes into an economic system, capitalism, that threatens to suffocate a human being's most fundamental, that is to say, most natural dimension, in which a non-alienated sense of self and connection to other people is intimately linked to a person's relation to and participation in the simplicity of the earth. As I mentioned, this dichotomy between nature and society, or between the natural and the artificial, has been correctly identified by many critics as a fundamental motif in Burgos's poetry. In what follows, I simply want to complicate a bit that dynamic. Looking at her work from what one might term an eco-critical perspective, we can identify a more subtle tension in her poetry that becomes visible when we connect her insistent affirmation of the primacy of the natural world with her seeming awareness of the unavoidably constructed and often gendered character of our concepts about nature. Although she offers a plea for the abandonment of artificial repressive identities, whether individual or collective, for the sake of nature as a realm of inherent value that pre-exists all social constructions, including the poetic text. What Burgos's work often shows most vividly is that the so-called natural self is rendered visible by the act of writing itself. The self, which in Burgos is individual, intersubjective, and collective, is identified with the natural, yet the natural is painstakingly and lovingly constructed through a figurative language that relentlessly flaunts its own rhetorical flourishes. We can notice the importance of this rich confluence of realms in the title of Burgos's first poetry collection, Poema en 20 surcos, from 1938. That is to say, a poem in 20 furrows. The poetry here is not merely about nature. It is shaped by the nature that it is trying to shape through language. Each of the 20 poems is a furrow in the semiotic field of the book. This is not necessarily a romantic declaration of Burgos's poems as spontaneous natural objects. It is a subtle joining of writing and nature, which leads us to the notion that nature, however we think of it, is always already scripted, always already mediated by language, history, and culture. Furrows, after all, are the imprint of human culture on nature, its cultivation. Take, for example, Rio Grande de Loíza, Burgos's most famous poem, written in praise of the river that runs through the town where the poet was born. The poem is a celebration of a concrete, specific river, which, as a natural phenomenon, pre-exists human concerns and representations, including the poetic text. However, in the poem, Burgos links the river to the stages of her life from childhood through adolescence to adulthood. My wellspring, my river since the maternal petal lifted me to the world, and my childhood was all a poem in the river. Adolescence arrived, etc., etc. An allegorical view with a long Heraclitean history that found its way to Spanish poetry, at least since Jorge Manrique's 15th century coplas. Nuestras vidas son los ríos que van a dar a la mar, que es el morir. In Burgos's poem, the river is also connected to Puerto Rico's colonial history, as we can see towards the end in the section in red, when it is described as el más grande llanto de todos nuestros llantos isleños, si no fuera más grande el que de mí sale por los ojos del alma para mi esclavo pueblo. You know, the great flood of tears, the greatest of all our island's tears, save those greater that come from the eyes of my soul for my enslaved people. Here, the metaphor opens the way to a more denotative reading when we consider the impact of colonial exploitation on Puerto Rico's nature and landscapes, including its rivers. Burgos also masculinizes the river. In other words, she makes the river masculine. Río hombre, único hombre que ha besado mi alma al besar en mi cuerpo. Man river, the only man who has kissed my soul upon kissing my body. This challenges a long history of images that feminize nature in order to justify its control, thereby problematizing the very notion that such characterizations of non-human beings and landscapes are natural at all. Burgos's awareness of the often uneasy confluence of nature and language comes to the foreground in her late poem, Romance de la Perla, where the poet uncharacteristically rejects the easy idealization of nature through lyrical language. The poem focuses on La Perla, an impoverished community that grew outside of the city walls of San Juan, where people who have often lacked access to basic human needs live surrounded by the striking natural beauty of the island's Atlantic coast. Yes, those are pictures of La Perla. Upper left is how La Perla looks today. The other two is closer to what La Perla would have looked like when Burgos was writing the poem. So again, a neighborhood where people who have often lacked access to basic human needs live surrounded by the striking natural beauty of the island's Atlantic coast. Consequently, the poet poses this challenge. ¿Quién dice noche estrellada ante los ojos caídos de esa frontera del hambre que va apartándose en gritos? ¿Quién dice marco de espumas ante el puntal del martirio que se resequen las almas huéspedes del precipicio? Who says starry night before the fallen eyes of that frontier of hunger that cramps and screams? Who says frame of foam at the pillar of martyrdom that becomes brittle in the souls that are guests of the precipice? There is, of course, nothing wrong with celebrating the beauty of that starry night, and of that foamy ocean which frames the landscape. However, Puerto Rican and Caribbean histories have too often been permeated by a high rhetoric that lyrically celebrates natural beauty while remaining indifferent to the suffering that colonial exploitation has inflicted on both human and non-human beings and landscapes. In the poem, Burgos both resists and appropriates that lyrical tradition. Desde el Puente Martín Peña, from Poema en 20 Surcos, opens with the image of a broken earth framed by a sea and sky that retain all of their beauty. Tierra rota, se hace el día el marco de la laguna. Un ejército de casas rompe la doble figura de un cielo azul que abastece a un mar tranquilo que arrulla. Un ejército de casas sobre el dolor se acurruca. As the poem progresses, the degradation of the earth is linked to that of its human inhabitants, as the poem gradually exposes the oppressive conditions that workers endure, misery and hunger. Against the seeming timelessness of sea and sky, the Puerto Rican society portrayed in the poem is still halfway between agriculture as the main source of livelihood and the urban industrial labor that would come to dominate in the following decades. In the first decades of the 20th century, both worlds were mediated by that most characteristic form of colonial domination over both humans and non-human nature in the Caribbean, the sugarcane plantation. The poetic voice extends an invitation to rebellion that calls for the city workers, the sugarcane workers, and the subsistence peasants to unite in their rebellion. Obreros, picad del miedo, vuestra es la tierra desnuda, saltad el hambre y la muerte por sobre la honda laguna y uníos a los campesinos y a los que en caña se anudan. Rómpanse 1,000,000 de puños contra moral tan injusta. Here, the impoverished workers are enticed to take possession of an earth that is described as naked. This image of nakedness, with its nuances of erotic intimacy, imagines an earth that has been metaphorically excised from the purely utilitarian system that has broken it. Human beings remain the main object of concern in Burgos's poetry. He was writing before the popularization of ecocentric challenges to anthropocentric assumptions. But we may regard the image of the naked earth as an attempt to put the colonial system that exploits humans and nature under erasure. In other words, the image signals the desire to overcome a long history which evidently cannot be totally undone either. The apostrophe to the workers constitutes an invitation that remains inevitably suspended between the desire it evokes for a naked or unwritten earth and the history that the rest of the poem documents, an earth that has already been broken. The naked earth cannot be experienced or recovered, but it can be nostalgically evoked through its absence. Burgos's faith in that nakedness, in that pure, unadulterated potency of nature that is often perceived as an absence, and which writing attempts to make present, is a dominant theme in several of her best-known works, whether they address collective issues or more intimate concerns. For example, in Nada, Nothing, addressing a lover who proclaims that life itself is nothingness, either because it is meaningless or because of its fleeting or illusory character, the poetic subject responds with a joyous attempt to value life as embodied material force, in which its very seeming nothingness, rather like the Buddhist notion of emptiness, becomes a fertile ground of endless possibilities. Brindemos por la nada del material reclamo, que se hunde y se levanta en tu carnal deseo. Como todo lo carne, relámpago, chispazo, en la verdad mentira sin fin del universo. And I'm actually going to read also the last stanza. Si del no ser venimos y hacia el no ser marchamos, nada entre nada y nada, cero entre cero y cero, y si entre nada y nada no puede existir nada, brindemos por el bello no ser de nuestros cuerpos. Let's toast the beautiful non-being of our bodies. This affirmation of the body and its desires goes hand in hand with Burgos's depiction of nature in other poems. In many of those works, sometimes obliquely, the poet proposes a recovery of nature and bodily desires in their pristine suchness, in their nakedness, before their repression and regulation by the discourses and practices of colonialism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. Burgos's battle is against becoming como los hombres quisieron que yo fuese, un intento de vida, as men wanted me to be, an attempt at life, as she states in Yo misma fui mi ruta. In that poem, the poet defiantly claims, yo estaba hecha de presentes. I was made of nows, and proclaims herself an inhabitant de todos los suelos de la tierra, de los suelos sin historia, de los suelos sin porvenir, del suelo, siempre suelo, sin orillas, of the soil, always soil, without edges. That soil or ground that remains always itself, that is to say, naked, existing in a concrete present beyond past and future, is in its suchness the source of an immediacy of experience that is free from the vagaries of history and its shackles. Of course, that recovery of unmediated primordial nature and natural bodies is not quite possible through language. And this creates a persistent tension in Burgos's poetry. That longing for what ecofeminist critic Donna Haraway calls another relationship to nature between reification and possession allows Burgos to combine in one gesture her attack on colonial domination of nature and workers and her rejection of the repression of desiring bodies, particularly sexist repression of the female body. Her poetry points to a repressed alterity that cannot be fully invoked as presence, but whose repression can be discursively represented. Moreover, the longing for those presences, nature itself, unmediated bodies, reveals them as the conditions of possibility for representation itself, even if they can never be fully accessed through representation. Nature precedes human concepts, even if we cannot conceive of it outside of human concepts. These ideas coalesce in one of Burgos's most important late poems, Poema para mi muerte, poem for my death, posthumously published in El Mar y Tú. The poet imagines her own death, morir conmigo misma, abandonada y sola, en la más densa roca de una isla desierta, and the gradual decomposition of her body as moments of liberation. Que nadie me profane la muerte con sollozos, ni me arropen por siempre con inocente tierra. Que en el libre momento me dejen libremente disponer de la única libertad del planeta. Con qué fiera alegría comenzarán mis huesos a buscar ventanitas por la carne morena. Y yo, dándome feroz y libremente, a la intemperie y sola, rompiéndome cadenas. ¿Quién podrá detenerme con ensueños inútiles cuando mi alma comience a cumplir su tarea, haciendo de mis sueños un amasijo fértil para el frágil gusano que tocará mi puerta? Cada vez más pequeña mi pequeñez rendida, cada instante más grande y más simple la entrega. Mi pecho quizás ruede a iniciar un capullo. ¿Acaso irán mis labios a nutrir azucenas? The poem depicts a deep recycling in which body parts, bones, breast, lips, and seemingly immaterial dimensions, soul, dreams, find their common measure in the earth that precedes them and to which they must ultimately return. An earth, it should be highlighted, that is not associated with death, but rather with the perpetually renovated, life-giving powers of nature itself. In this non-hierarchical realm, the human self is not inherently superior to worms and flowers, but rather coexists with them in the context of the dynamic interbeing of forms that arise and pass away. However, even in this eloquent invocation of that realm that contains and transcends the human, we find an important clarification in the last stanza. ¿Cómo habré de llamarme cuando solo me quede recordarme en la roca de una isla desierta? Un clavel interpuesto entre el viento y mi sombra. Hijo mío y de la muerte me llamará poeta. This ending again calls attention to the need to name, to language, representation, and the poetic endeavor. Although the poetic subject proclaims and celebrates the freedom of her dissemination among the earth, worms, and flowers outside of the poem, the personified flower in the poem, which quite logically occupies a liminal place between the poet and death, the sayable and the unsayable. That flower calls her back to her task and craft, the poetic task of pointing, using names and labels, to that possible freedom beyond names and labels. And at this point, I should highlight that the dynamic that I am trying to highlight is often a feature in what is called nature writing. And it closely mirrors one of the main tensions at the heart of environmental criticism and eco-criticism. I am referring to what critic Timothy Clark calls the antinomy of environmental criticism. What any writer calls nature can always be read as a cultural political construction. But culture always depends on and is encompassed by actual nature, which requires recognition. But that nature can always be read as a cultural political construction, but etc., etc. It is an antinomy that can be experienced as a paralyzing conundrum or as a spur to always recommence the attempt to loosen oppressive constraints in multiple realms, including the very realm of struggles for emancipation and the realm of representing those struggles. Given that we see throughout Burgos's poems a notion of a nested self, multifariously constructed by different realms, biological, social, political, spiritual, I would argue that her attempts to achieve liberation in one of those realms always implicitly involve the others. Burgos's poems celebrate nature as a domain of total liberation that always remains partially out of reach, a full presence that language cannot fully achieve, but which, to quote Gayatri Spivak, it cannot not want, and which pushes poetry to that which lies beyond the limits of poetry. Arguably, only poetry can adequately perform that task. Thank you very much. That's what I have for you. I will stop my sharing. And if there are any comments or questions or comments,
I think
very happy to hear them.
I think Jacqueline would want you to raise your hand using the reaction button.
Okay.
If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand so she can recognize you. I see Lee Simmons, huh?
Yes, hello. I had a question.
Sure.
You mentioned specifically a number of times about how she spoke about decomposition and kind of returning to the earth after death. I'm kind of wondering, how did her beliefs line up with the kind of general understanding of death at the time? Because I know in the US, the primary version of death and burial was being embalmed, essentially being buried in a stone coffin so your body would last as long as possible. I'm curious if was that the general understanding in Puerto Rico as well? Did she hold that belief, or did she fall under a different category?
That is an interesting question. I didn't think about that issue from that perspective. I can tell you that no, the traditional view in Puerto Rico at the time, and to a certain degree up to today, would be the traditional Catholic notion of how you should dispose of a body. You may embalm it or not, but you bury it. That's what you would do with the body. So to that extent, you could say that she is very much rebelling against what a traditional notion of what is supposed to happen with a dead body should be. Of course, it's not that she's coming up with this idea, but it's very much against the grain of what the cultural and social norm in Puerto Rico would have been at that time. Now, of course, just like here, people dispose of bodies in all kinds of ways, including cremation, which a lot of people choose, but not back then. Of course, here, as often in this kind of conversation, we have to make a distinction between the person, the author, and the poetic subject that is constructed in the poem. Whether Julia de Burgos, the person, the poet, thought in real life or had any ideas of how she wanted her body to be treated after her death, that is something I don't know. But yeah, that's an interesting observation. This will be kind of against the current, against the grain of the prevalent cultural norm at her time in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, because I feel like how and where we bury our dead is a very significant part of any culture. So if her beliefs don't align with the general understanding of the culture around her that she grew up in, I think that speaks volumes to her character.
Absolutely. And, that brings up another question about, which again, I cannot give you a definite answer for, which is about Burgos's personal beliefs about these issues, and we have very different, let's say, sources giving us different, sometimes contradictory information about her in that regard. In some regards, like everyone, she was a woman from the 1930s in Puerto Rico. In some regards, she was somewhat traditional in some of her beliefs. On the other hand, we also have, in fact, just kind of reading materials for this talk. I was last night reading some of her letters to her sister when she was living in New York City that have been compiled in book form. And there, in one of the letters, she's making fun of a Puerto Rican family in New York City that was going to a spiritist seance, trying to evoke the spirit of someone's dead husband, which actually was not an uncommon practice in Puerto Rico in the early 20th century. Spiritist and spiritualist beliefs were very prevalent. And Burgos very kind of assertively says in the letter, I think all of that is bullcrap. I am materialist, and I think we disappear and mix with the earth, which I suppose you could say connects with this poem, except that in many other poems, she's constantly talking about this, about the soul, the spirit, these other worldly realms that suggest that part of her may have actually held what you might call religious beliefs, maybe of a more pantheistic nature. But all of that is kind of difficult to ascertain with any degree of certainty in her case, as far as I have seen anywhere. As I guess it is for most of us. I think we believe something, but
Great, thank you.
Anyway, thanks for the question, Lee. That's interesting. I know that Roxana had
Oh, yeah, I just have a comment. I think it's really interesting how she sees herself, or how death, since nature is the domain of total liberation, and therefore her own decomposition and death is when she is totally free, right? So the view of that was just really beautiful to me. Thank you, Victor. Julia de Burgos.
thank you, Roxana. It is a beautiful vision. But again, I mean, I would insist the paradox is you want to dissolve, you want to disintegrate and become one with the all, but you want to be able to hold on to enough coherence to be able to name it and be able to convey to the other how awesome it is not to exist anymore. But you have to retain and construct some kind of persistence in time, so that you can properly celebrate what it feels like to be finally out of that cycle as an individual. So yes, it is probably one of her most beautiful poems, and she actually didn't have a chance to publish it in her lifetime. It was published after her death, in her posthumous volume. Yeah. Jose.
Yeah, she's reflecting the primal religion, or at least part of it, that all humans shared at the very beginning, when we were still hunters and gatherers, and even into early agriculture, and which you still find in many, particularly Native American statements of religion and practice and rituals. It's the idea that we are part of nature, and that all nature, including us and trees, even the rocks, consist of some holy or living substance that's there. And so we are not superior to nature. We don't want to dominate nature, and we have to live with nature. And of course, all human perceptions are conceptual. We can't, otherwise we wouldn't be human. So we will always be a reflection, or have a partial understanding of what the universe is, what reality is. So what the primal religion did and what it does for Native Americans, this is why they're considered losers, is that you basically try to form a life and a society. Your social rules actually, and your conceptions of nature, are aimed at integrating yourself into nature. Whereas once civilization arises, civilization, in my view, is really anti-natural. It's toxic to nature. Civilization takes from nature, creates artificiality in increasing amounts and dimensions, and separates us further and further from nature. And so if you look at what is the core of civilization, it's cities. What do cities do? They take from nature, and the only thing they give back is sewage and garbage. We do nothing really to preserve nature, to have a relationship with nature that is mutually satisfying to both nature and us. And I believe that's deeply ingrained in all humans to one degree or another, that we long for return to that nature, because we lived in that for millions of years, and we've only been human in the sense that we are now for about 70,000 years. So it's a primordial urge to merge with God and the universe and return to where we came from. And we all know that science has already proven that everything is constructed of the same matter in nature, and that energy and matter can go back and forth, and there's no loss of substance, or the core thing that's there. And so, yeah, she seems to be, I don't know, that's the question, is that, was this an intuitive writing or thinking by her, or was she heavily influenced by other literatures, or her contact with maybe Native peoples? I don't know. Is there, do you know of any sources that might have influenced her to take this perspective?
That is a good question, and actually the answer is we're not sure. Already after she published her first book, I mean, some of these poems were from her first book. Some critics were actually sometimes in a very condescending way, the way male white critics can be condescending toward a woman of color gaining prominence in any field. We're kind of pondering, how is it possible that this young woman has this deep ideas with far-reaching metaphysical implications, sort of the kind you're laying out, Jose. And most of what we know is that she did a lot of reading on her own, and she was very interested in philosophy, and she was reading a lot on her own. What exactly, we don't even have a clear sense of what books she was reading. Whether she was, I do not think, as far as I know, unless something comes up that we haven't seen at all until now, whether she was in contact with any specific indigenous wisdom or African wisdom. Not that we know of. As far as we know, her path was relatively conventional. She was born in the countryside in Puerto Rico, but then moved to the city. She did complete her high school there. She couldn't really go to university because she didn't have the money to do it. So she did complete the 2 years of training normal school to become a teacher. And by that point, she was already writing. So
sometimes you find a very huge collective expression of what she was saying. For example, in the 19th century, Thoreau was part of a much larger movement
of course, sure,
criticism of civilization and return to nature, and we got to get back to to our roots. So I think it is something that we all share to one extent or another, because if you think of what the situation where we're living now, we might as well be in a spaceship, in terms of our food supply, our air supply, everything. We depend on trucks to deliver. We go to the supermarket. Hunting and gathering today is not going to find a sacred animal, doing a whole ritual about killing it, thanking the animal, coming back and eating it, and being grateful to nature and to the animal that fed us. Now hunting and gathering means going to the supermarket and figuring out which package good we want. So there's that separation.
We are in a spaceship. It goes around the sun every 365 days. Yeah. Anyway, I want to have time for Caroline's, and I know we're close to the end of time. So yes.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank
This
you,
is
Jose.
just briefly, and you've already started to maybe address my question, which is the shape of her writing life, and maybe a little bit of context between her second volume and the posthumous third volume. And I'm always interested in what, different pathways writers take in terms of their own productivity and engagement with the public.
Well, it's interesting. That's a question that has divided critics quite a bit. Her first poem her first book, and several of the poems I quoted were from her first book, has her most famous poems by far. The one about the river, the one where she's addressing herself, which is very well known. And it has her most direct, explicitly political poetry. It's a very in-your-face kind of volume of just 20 poems, but very powerful in that regard. The second volume, which appeared only 1 year later, has a totally different kind of poetic voice, much more private, much more intimate, and much more focused on love poetry. And there has been this recurrent tendency to tie that very biographically to what was going on in her life at that point. She had this man who was her lover. They went together to Cuba, but he came from an aristocratic family. He was actually Dominican, and his family was rejecting her. So that book has been read through that lens, and it hasn't been until more recently, the last decade or so, that critics have started to look at that poetry with, well, no, let's really see what's happening here in terms of how the poet is constructing herself, even within this rhetoric of romance and lost love and longing, no? And sure enough, it's still the same poetic voice, but you could say a bit more subtle, a bit and not as explicit in the way she kind of carves her space for herself. It's always kind of in the context of this relationship with this lover. Then the third volume, it's still more in the vein of the second one, but you can maybe almost begin to see the pendulum either come back or to move to a new stage, which is not quite only romantic poetry, but it's not as explicitly political as the first one either, no? And you can see that in the title, El Mar y Tú, the sea and you. There's still that you that she's addressing the poems to, but the part about the sea, Julia de Burgos became famous, and she was aware of this from her association with the river, with that poem about the river. So in this last volume, there is a very clear self-awareness of moving beyond the river towards the sea as a different kind of space that would allow her, a critic calls it an archipelago aesthetics. It was in the works where she died, so we don't know what final shape it would have taken, but it is certainly beginning to expand and move outward again. So that is kind of like the basic arc that her poetry took. I hope that answers roughly the question. I would have to get into more details about each book.
Were there any more questions or comments? If not, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. I'm so happy that you all got to reconnect in some way through this platform. And Dr. Figueroa, the Humanities Center wanted to give you a caddy with our logo on it and a mask as well with our logo on it.
Oh, a mask,
as
awesome.
a thank you, and I'll reach out to you to see how we can get that to you. And as for everyone else, this talk has been recorded and will be available on our website shortly if you did want to share it with anyone else. So thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Walter, always for creating this forum that allows us to share these ideas and conversations. Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks.